introducing the Arthur Tress collection of Japanese illustrated books with Julie Nelson-Davis and Arthur Tress. I'm Laura Perrings, the Director of Programs and Education at Rare Book School, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming all of you and our two presenters this afternoon. Julie Nelson-Davis is a Rare Book School faculty member and is also a professor of art history at the University of Pennsylvania. And Arthur Tress is, of course, a renowned photographer and collector. We ask that everyone keep their video feeds off throughout the event to help with our bandwidth problems. I will say that here in Charlottesville, we have a thunderstorm coming in, so hopefully we won't have an interruption on our connection. We will begin the Q&A around 4:40 p.m. and we will open the chat feature shortly before that time so that you can enter any questions that you have there. And then a member of the Rare Book School staff will moderate the questions and read them to our presenters. Julie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm delighted to be here with Arthur Tress and to have this chance to share his collection and what it means to us at the University of Pennsylvania. And also really just to have this wonderful opportunity to talk with Arthur about his experience as a collector and his work as a photographer, and how these two worlds of Japanese illustrated books and photography overlapped and intersect. So Arthur, would you like to say hello?
Okay, hi, I'm Arthur, and I'll be talking to you about my experiences in Japan in the 60s. So I think that'll be very interesting.
I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm really excited about this. So today, as I said, we're going to have a conversation about Arthur's appreciation of Japanese illustrated books, his collection, and how these books have been important to his work as a photographer. We're going to start with a reflection on how both of us arrived at this fascinating topic of the Japanese illustrated book. And then we will talk about how his collection is being used at Penn and about the project of an exhibition that we're working on now. As I mentioned, or as you probably know, Arthur is a world famous photographer. And I thought I would start by asking Arthur if he wanted to say a few words about these two pictures that are on the screen right now. Arthur, did you mean to turn your camera off?
No, it seems that you did.
Oh, can we turn Arthur back on?
It said host. Okay.
Well, anyway, Arthur, do you want to say a word while we, there you are. Wonderful. Here are two photographs, a recent self-portrait and then one of your most famous photographs. I wondered if you wanted to say a word or two about these.
Well, I think it's important for a photographer to do the occasional self-portrait. But what's interesting is that even though it's 2018, I still use a Hasselblad camera. And that's analog with a 120 Tri-X black and white film. And so I think it's interesting to do a self-portrait of yourself every couple of years. So I'm 80 now, to my happy amazement. And so I think we are living in very serious times. So it's probably, unfortunately, a rather grave expression, but it's an interesting picture. And actually, the other photo from 50 years earlier was from a series I did on children's dreams, published in a book called The Dream Collector, and where I was trying to illustrate different kinds of dreams without manipulation, just using straight photography. So this has become the most famous image of the series. And the roof was on the ground. The little boy just came up and put his head through the roof, and in the background was an abandoned ferry boat after a storm. So it became a very kind of magic moment. In fact, in some ways, it's very Japanese. It has a kind of mysterious, ambiguous, almost ghostly quality, which is something very often seen in Japanese art and literature.
And one of the things that, you told me very early on was about how you'd always loved illustrated books. And you shared this picture of you that appeared in the newspaper. And you also told me a lot of stories about the Japanese garden. And so I thought it might be fun for us to talk a little bit, just for a minute, about how even from the time you were a child, you were fascinated by these things.
Okay. I grew up in a kind of interesting section of Brooklyn in the 1940s. I was born in 1940, just down the street from the Brooklyn Museum and the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and also the Brooklyn Public Library main branch. And the main branch had a children's room, and parents would just, you could be 4 or 5 years old, they just put you in the street. Okay, go out. And you could do whatever you wanted. So I'd walk up the street, go past the Brooklyn Museum to the children's room at the Brooklyn Public Library, which is a vast Art Deco building. And actually, I didn't like the children's room. So I'd go over to the adult section and look at all the big picture books. And so I'm looking at a book of Audubon birds. And that was my favorite book. And so actually, there's a lot of bird imagery in my work. And then, they were doing a newspaper story on children at the library. But I've always been fascinated by illustrated books. Another interesting aspect, which is very strange, the Japanese gardens during World War II were closed to the public. But I was small enough to be able to climb under the little bamboo fence entrance. So I had this vast garden. It was overgrown with empty caves where there used to be waterfalls. That became my first experience of Japan. And I just used to love hanging out there, sometimes with friends of my own age. And then I'd also wander over to the Brooklyn Museum, which was kind of empty because there were no guards. And I'd wander in and look at the Egyptian mummies and things like that. So it was I've always been, as a child, I was not interested in sports. I'd play with puppets and paper dolls. So I was really a kind of a loner child. And so that kind of set up my sensibility for the rest of my life, I think.
And then in 1965, you went to Japan for the first time.
Yes.
And discovered Japanese illustrated books.
Yeah. Starting around 1963, one could get a student deferment to avoid the Vietnam War. And it was even better if you were out of the country. So I kind of began a 6-year odyssey around the world, and I applied to the Zen Study Center in Kyoto, which I had found out about, and they accepted me as a student. Strangely enough, I was the only student. and the director of the school was Dr. Shohaku Ogata. And he wrote a book in English called Zen in the West. And he was an older man. And he and I used to go out to different restaurants. And I told him I wasn't interested in meditating, but I wanted to study ikebana and gardening. So this is Japan after World War II, and they were very poor. It was only 20 years after the war. So in the backyard, there was this shabby little garden that was run down. and he and I tried to restore it. And I planted some pine trees and maple trees, which are there still today. And I think that was a great experience for my own work. But in this section of Tokyo and of Kyoto, I'd wander around, and then I found an old bookstore on one of the main boulevards. And these bookstores are still there. They're handed down from father to son. It's a family business. So I've revisited them. But it was packed to the ceiling with Japanese books. I had never seen anything like that. And they were 5 or 10. You could buy a Hokusai for $10. And I just began hoarding them. I just thought they were wonderful. And I had a whole pile of them, which I sent back to New York eventually. And that sort of became my beginning of the collection. And as years went by, on a limited artist budget, I'd buy 10 or 20 books a year. But you know, after 3 decades or 6 decades, you did accumulate more and more. And I would revisit Japan from time to time and buy more books. And there was very little information about what these books were, even Japanese or English. There had been no exhibitions or books on different artists like Hokusai or Udamaru rarely mentioned the books, just the prints. So it was all kind of just guesswork. And I just chose whatever I thought was visually exciting to see.
And here are a couple of photographs we talked about yesterday, just talking about your experience in Japan. And these are 2 of my favorites from this moment. When you told me yesterday about how you accidentally ended up there.
Oh yes, in Kyoto, in an old store, I found a postcard, a vintage postcard of a little fishing village in Shikoku, Uwajima. And it was famous for its curved walls that supported little farms. And I said, I'm gonna go there. And so I took several ferries to get there, and I ended up, I don't speak Japanese. I just show people this postcard. And they told me what bus and train to get on. And at that time, there was still a lot of traditional Japan left. There were farmers and fishermen and little villages, especially on the more remote islands. So it was a wonderful experience. And
sorry, I thought you were ready to go forward.
no, I think that's, okay, we can go. But what happened with Shikoku is it turned out that Shikoku is the island of the 88 temples of the Shikoku Kobo Daishi pilgrimage. And around 1985, I returned to the same village. I was doing a story with Oliver Stadler on the Japanese pilgrimage. He's written a book about it. And visited all the 88 temples. Henro Michi, Pilgrim Path. And now, unfortunately, in this little village, most of the old farmers are gone, and they've kind of become summer homes for people from big cities who want to get away from it all. But it's still there if anyone wants to see it.
And of course, you've had an amazing life in the art world, and I loved this photo of you with.
I became friends with Izuma Noguchi. I originally photographed him in Takamatsu, Shikoku. The Japanese government gave him a kind of land grant where he could set up a studio in a village of traditional stone carvers. And they would usually make stone lanterns and things for Japanese gardens, but he used their abilities to make sculptures, to realize his sculptures. And I had lunch with him on his veranda, And I did some beautiful color photos. He was creating a Japanese garden for himself. And then those were published in art magazines. And then later, Art News asked me to photograph him for a story they were doing about the Noguchi Museum in New York. So that's me on the left.
And then all this time you're collecting books, and you have an exhibition in 1982 at Queens College, which I think is probably one of the first exhibitions dedicated to Japanese illustrated books.
By that time, I had accumulated quite an interesting little collection. And there was a professor at Queens College, Gabriel Latterman, who was also an artist. And it's interesting that artists like Van Gogh and Degas were the first people to, Monet, collect Japanese books. Even Picasso collected Japanese shunga later on. Mm-hmm. But Gabriel had a few hundred books, I had a few hundred books, and he decided that we could make a catalog, an exhibition, which you can still get the catalog online. And the person who wrote the catalog, Victoria Daskovich Perto, was an emigre in New York from the Hermitage Museum, where she had been the Japanese print collector. So she knew about Japanese books, and so this amazingly was one of the first exhibits in America, and perhaps even the West, of the Japanese books. They had been included in other exhibits about prints, but not just on their own. And later, the DeYoung Museum has a rare book gallery, one of the few in the United States, that's dedicated in a major museum just to showing illustrated books. It's called the Reva and David Logan Gallery of Illustrated Books. It's a beautiful gallery. So I suggested to the museum, we do an exhibit of my Japanese book collection, which by that time is probably 1,000 books. And we selected different views of Mount Fuji, starting from about 1700 to 1920. And it was a very popular exhibit.
So meanwhile, I'm also going through a transition in my experience as an art historian. I started out as someone working on paintings and then moved into print culture. And I had already done some work on prints, on Japanese prints, but I realized at Penn that I needed to do more to be able to engage this material and to think about the book world. And so I teamed up with these two colleagues, Linda Chance and Frank Chance, and we decided that we were going to collaborate, and we were going to teach ourselves how to read pre-modern calligraphy. And this is actually a really difficult thing. And I brought this little chart in to just give you a sense of how hard it is. Today, Japanese has standard kana or syllabary system to render all the Chinese characters and also to render Japanese words. It's a kind of complicated system that I won't go into. But now the standard character is up here at the right, in this case, ah. But in pre-modern Japan, you could write it any one of these 5 ways. You could write the sound ah if you're writing in kana in any kind of 5 ways. So it's a kind of reading practice that is very complicated. In this chart, you've got the examples that eventually become the standard for kana today, and the number of variants. So you can see right away that if you're a skilled calligrapher, you have lots of choices if you're going to be writing a word. And the 3 of us decided that we were going to learn how to do this. And we started with a do-it-yourself kind of book. And then we started running Kazushiji workshops, and we brought in Laura Moretti, who's in the picture on the right, who is one of the great authorities on this. And we still run these workshops every summer. We're going to have one next week over Zoom. And then, we started working with our library. We started finding like all the books that were in storage that hadn't been used in a long time and playing with those. And then our librarian, our curator, Lynn Farrington, bought us this little book about Japanese kimono design. This is a woodblock printed book, but it looks like calligraphy, right? And it's incredibly hard to read. And so we worked on it. We read it together. And Linda and I eventually wrote an essay about issues about how to read these things in the example on the right. Now, this is all kind of useful information to know, because I think one of the reasons why Arthur and I enjoy working with each other so much is that we have the same sort of goal in mind, to just really share this experience of the Japanese illustrated book with lots and lots of people, and to give them the kinds of ability to engage in this. But none of this would be possible without the support of the library, of the people who are so important to us there in the Conservation Lab, in the Kislek Center, the Materials Library, and who support this kind of teaching. Now before I even knew Arthur, we were starting to use a lot of more materials actively in the classroom. And we had some wonderful donors that helped us support that early mission. But my real transformation into a book person became when I was asked to be part of the Pulverer collection project. And Dr. Pulverer collected 900 Japanese illustrated books, and these were purchased by the Freer and Sackler museums in Washington, D.C., part of the Smithsonian. And they had started to put these online, but at the time they called me in to work on it, only 44 of those books were online. So I began, I worked with Alessandro Bianchi, who is a really talented person, could read everything. And he and I got the whole collection online. So I recommend that if you're curious, have a look at this website. They digitize their books cover to cover, which is something we aspire to do as well. I also wrote this book, which had a lot to do with illustrated books. And so in 2017 was when I met Arthur. He sent me an email, and I'll read you the beginning of the email. The email says, "Dear Julie, I enjoyed your Partners in Print book very much. Now, let me just say to everybody, if you want to get an academic's attention, this is the way to do it. I mean, nobody writes to me and says they liked my book. Arthur did. And he said, I own several Seikien volumes. He's one of my favorites. And I have an approximately 1,000 title collection of Japanese illustrated books. And so we started this really, for me, life-changing correspondence. I think we exchange emails, I don't know, 5 to 10 to 20 times a week, always about Japanese illustrated books, because I have so much to learn from Arthur. I also learned at this point that Arthur had been working with my colleague, Jonathan Katz, who has shown many of Arthur's photographs in his exhibitions. Arthur, I've just been blabbing away. Do you want to say a word here?
No, excuse me? Yes.
Do you want to say anything at this point? I mean, okay. And then Arthur invited me to come. He sent me this photograph, which shows on the left his archive, his photo archive, and on the right, his Japanese illustrated book collection. And then he invited me to come to his house. He told me, this is one of my favorite things. He said, you only need about 3 days to see my collection. Well, this is not true, Arthur. But I came for 3 days with my graduate student, Quintana Heathman, and we got a chance to look at Arthur's collection. And here I just have a couple of images. On the left, a photograph Arthur sent me showing how he displays books and sort of meditates on them throughout his day. And then a photo I took of one of Arthur's photographs arranged in this really beautiful way in his house.
Could we go back to the photograph of me and the
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry. No, back one.
One more?
Yes. Okay, that's myself in 1965 in Nara with Reverend Kobayashi. He's from Ninanji Temple, which is one of the headquarters for studying flower arrangement. And he became my personal teacher. That's with his fiancée. And so I think to understand Japanese books, they're really products of a Buddhist culture in a way. The themes, the stories, the haiku, the way the floating world, all those concepts. And I, come from the way of tea, the way of, wabi-sabi. And so when you pick up these books, they're on this lovely soft paper. It's really a spiritual experience. And somehow I hope that the schools that are teaching this material emphasize that as much as the more technological, economic situations with the books, how those books came into being. Because I think students, as well as looking for, information about the books, are also kind of searching in themselves for some kind of spiritual way. And I think just experiencing these books will help you with that. And if you look at the two books on my shelf there, one are plovers. They're by Hokusai. It's a book of poetry about the different seasons and about the moon. And I think see the plover, the moon is reflected as a circle and the waves. And the birds are kind of flying over them. And the moon certainly was a Buddhist symbol of purity, a little bit like Mount Fuji. And so it's a spiritual image as well as, being what it was. So I think it's important to emphasize, rarely done, about that kind of background for these materials. Okay, that's what I have to say. By the way, Mr. Kobayashi became one of the head monks of Ninanji Temple as the years went by. And you can stay there. They have rooms to let to travelers and tourists, pilgrims. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to show a couple of pictures, one here of you showing me a book at your house, and then the other one when you came to Penn, and I got to walk around with you while you're taking photographs. I got to watch you at this moment, and I really enjoyed it. But I want to be sure to show something about what happened when your collection came to us. You gave us the collection, and it came to us to Penn in the summer of 2018. And at that moment, we needed to make a list for you so that you could have the appraisal done. So my two students that you see here in the upper right of the image, Naoko Adachi and Tim Jong, spent 6 weeks full-time making the list, and I helped. I followed along behind and checked everything that they did. And I think you and I both were surprised, Arthur, when we discovered it was 1,410 items that you sent.
Yes.
From the 17th century. I mean, it was a couple hundred more than I think we anticipated. And these are just the title count. This is not the volume count. So it's many, many more volumes than that.
Can I show the box that I have?
Sure, you can show us the box, and I'll keep talking for a second. But it also, as you can see, included some single sheet prints and a triptych, a broadsheet, 3 Chinese titles, and 1 Korean title that's metal movable type, which is also incredibly rare, and a woodblock. And so our list became the basis for the appraisal, and then the list became the records that are now available on the Penn Library website. So show us your box.
Okay, all right. Well, since I gave in the collection in 2018, I said, well, enough Japanese books, right? There are other things in life. But like any compulsive collector, I couldn't stop, you know. So since 2018, I've accumulated perhaps another 12 of these boxes. And I don't collect methodically. I just kind of scrounge around and try to find interesting books. And I don't worry too much about their condition. It's important to relate that this is a study collection. I really wanted people to have a hands-on experience of the books, but also when buying them, books are much less expensive if they're missing a few pages, if they're a little damaged. I mean, some of these books are 300 or 400 years old, and so the prices are much discounted. So more sophisticated, wealthy collectors only want to go for the most perfect examples. But many books only exist in the damaged condition or incomplete condition. And so I was able to, but you still can find some extraordinary things. And many, as Julie and I are finding out, many of the books in my collection are quite rare and scarce, and perhaps the only copies that exist. And so we're all amazed. So I'm just going to pull out, and this is kind of random. This is a book of haiku from around the late 1700s. Done on sort of very rough paper. Very minimalist. So it's fabulous. It only costs a few $100s because it's missing its covers and it has a few repairs. So,
So Arthur, can I show some of the other ones from your collection?
yes, I just wanted, yes, let's start on that because there's a lot, I think.
Okay. I think I've done this properly. Okay. So,
yes.
So one of the amazing things was Arthur's mostly collected woodblock printed books, but there were some illustrated manuscripts in this collection. And this is a thing that from my point of view as someone teaching the history of Japanese art, this is really important because it provides a link between painting and the book format. Of course, many paintings started as hanging scrolls or hand scrolls, and then you move into this kind of codex format. But it also shows the kind of perpetuation, the kind of interest in things, and it's also a really great example of how people actively engaged in this material. Arthur has a great story about this, but I'm going to have him hold off on that until later because I want to show you all these books that we selected. Here's another really great example of something that's called in Japanese a tonnokubon, which means a red and green book. And that has to do with the fact that it has these really rough illustrations that have only this kind of sort of slapdash coloring on them. And this opening, as you can see, also includes a little bit of graffiti here. But this is also really an important book in the history of Japanese illustrated books and print culture because it is a movable type book. And Japanese experimented with movable type, particularly movable type cut out of wood, but also cast some metal movable type. But it was a very short-lived experiment because it was more efficient for the kinds of books that they wanted to produce. It seems to do them with wood blocks. And many of the photographs that are in this, I just want to give a shout out to my student who took these excellent photographs, Derek Rodenbeck. Arthur, I'm just going to keep going and you tell me when you want to interrupt. Here are some wonderful poetry books. Both of these examples are important in the history of Japanese literacy because they included poems that many people memorized. Many people learned to read using these kinds of poetry books. They're also, as you can see, beautifully illustrated. They're really beautiful examples of the genre. This is a book. I don't think either of us knew quite how rare this book is, Arthur. We knew it was a kind of example of extreme and decorative calligraphy. In fact, this kind of calligraphy is thought the kind of calligraphy that was done by well-to-do women. And in fact, the calligrapher whose work is being represented here is a woman calligrapher. She worked at court for part of her life, and then she retired from court and continued to teach women how to write calligraphy. And what we're looking at here is a kind of primer, and it's a book that is about writing letters. And this volume covers the period from winter to spring and has all the kinds of seasonal things that you would want to say. This is incredibly difficult to read, as you can imagine, but it's also partly about the decorativeness and about the skill of the calligrapher. And I think, Arthur, what I'm really blown away by here too is the skill of the carvers. And this is one of those ones where the experience of looking at this is just, it's stunning in terms of the artistic practice here. Should I keep going?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Go back one.
Okay.
Go back one.
One more?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, the book on the right, I think it might be interesting. Now, how did I acquire these books?
Yeah.
Part of it was through the occasional auction at Christie's or Sotheby's. And being an artist, I never had a big budget, but I would find things occasionally. But also, there were dealers in Japanese prints, a few of whom had books. And there was a wonderful dealer in Paris. Of course, in Paris was where all the Japanese books originally landed in the late 1900s. So, so on Place de Vosges, she had a little Japanese print shop. And then she closed down her business. And in France, you have to get rid of all your assets. So I went up to her apartment, and she had a few little books left. And she sold it to me at an inexpensive price. But it seems to be the only extant existing copy of this book, which was by Masayoshi. And there are other books without the poems, other copies, but this is the only copy with the poems. And it had been brought to Japan, to Paris, probably in the 1890s, and sort of drifted down. So each book has its own collecting adventure to it. And now they're kind of available much more. But in those days, one really had to hunt them up, especially in the West.
Yes, as far as we know, this is the only copy of this book that has the printed calligraphy. It seems like some of these were sold without the calligraphy, and the idea was that you could write the calligraphy in yourself. Yes. So this is, we haven't found another copy of this, and we haven't found another copy of this one either. And that's pretty exciting. Now this pair of books is probably one that is in a number of collections, but they're really important in terms of the history of what it meant to be an artist in Japan, with something like the Hanabusa Icho book being a book that is a collection of his paintings that are then put into this mode of the woodblock printed book. And the one on the right is also very interesting from the point of view of showing the extraordinary people of Japan, thinking about who these extraordinary people were. And here in the back, on the left side of this sheet, we have Hokusai in his older age. And I think one of the strengths of your collection is these books that are called gafu, or painting albums. And these are really, first of all, like you said, Arthur, it's a transformative experience to hold this in your hand and to have this sort of, first of all, this sort of connection back to that artist, but also to have this experience of turning the pages and thinking about the pacing and everything. But the way that, you seem to sort of intuitively pick up these books about what it meant to be an artist really is stunning to me.
Well, the Gafu books have lots of full-page double pictures, and so they're wonderful to experience and watch how they were, the variety of types of images, plus the iconography. A lot of these books now have been translated into English. They have been reproduced. And so even though I couldn't read the Japanese, I was eventually able to find out what they were about. In fact, Miriam Wattles has written a whole book, like a 300-page book just on this one page.
Basically, her book on Hanabusa Icho, yeah.
Yes, because this was the first time that this theme of this woman in the boat seems to have been done as an ink painting and then was disseminated as a drawing, as this on this wood. What's it called? Azuma something.
Yes, exactly. Azuma Bune, I think, the boat of the East. And so,
of course, Hokusai, there is a lot of Hokusai in the collection, because on my first trip to Japan in 1965, he was the only artist I was interested in. He was the artist I knew about. So I would just comb all these old bookstores in Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto, asking for Hokusai books. I found quite a bit of material. And, but he's an artist that I personally identify with.
Yeah. So I'm going to show this amazing monkey because of the ways in which Mori Sosen, who was an 18th century famous painter in the Kyoto, Osaka area, he was famous for his ability to render fur. And I really love the way in which the woodblock carver captured that and kept it in this image. And then, of course, the book on the right, which is a kind of appreciation of the 18th century painter Ogata Korin. The thing that's so incredible about this book is that the sort of depth of the printing and the color and the sort of deep materiality of it that they were able to capture so beautifully. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to just show the other ones quickly and we can come back. These is a couple of others that we chose, the Kawamura Bunpo and Tani Buncho. Arthur's also, wisely collected broadly in this field. So he didn't, just a lot of people specialize in one area, but he's interested in the whole spectrum of experience. And here we have painting, two books that are about painting style. It was promoted by people who are interested in China and interested in Chinese literati experience. So that's another feature here. And Arthur, I will never forget the day you walked up to me and at your house and you handed me this book and you said, "Do you know this book?" And I was actually supervising a student who was writing a chapter of her dissertation about this very book. And we had gone all the way to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to look at this book, and you handed it to me in your dining room. And this is one of the most important books in the history of Japanese printing because it's the first what we call full color of 5 or more color woodblocks being used. for printing. And this appeared first in books before it happened in sheet prints. And this book is just gorgeous. And one of my students, Derek, tried to capture the ways in which you get this incredible sort of overprinting of color and mica on the surface. This is one of those books that is transformative when you hold it in your hand. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Katsushika Oe, I think everybody at Penn remembers the day when this book came into my hands, because I was in the quiet reading room and almost started shrieking out loud. I was so excited because this is an illustration by Katsushika Oe, Hokusai's daughter, at the age of 10, and probably the earliest known illustration. And I also remember you showed me this beautiful book on the right at your house. One of the most beautiful books, I think, I've ever seen, because of the way in which it uses color and metallics and other things here. Should I keep going?
Oh, yes. But, you can see the comparison. One, the very simple printing in black and white, and then the more elaborate printing, but also the extraordinary minimalism of the sails of the boats in the fog, and you can see how this art affected people like Degas and Van Gogh, at that period. So.
And what's amazing is you've collected a lot of poetry books like this one, and this one includes poems from the group of poets who sponsored this book. This book does as well on other pages. One of the things I really like about this book is that here we have a whole sequence of numbers that are the rankings that other people gave the books, the poems. So you also have this kind of wonderful sort of, period appreciation going on. You and I love kabuki books, and this is one that kind of thing that I don't often see in museum exhibitions. It's a kind of like a program that you would take home, and these are two very early illustrated popular books. Arthur, you collected in this field when a lot of people didn't. A lot of people who were, collecting Japanese illustrated books didn't collect these kinds of popular books. And I think some of these we'll find you're probably unique to your collection.
Yes, these were kind of like little throwaway programs. But, it's amazing, that they survived hundreds of years after earthquakes, fires, and World War II destroyed a lot of libraries in Japan. And so these little bits of ephemera that have drifted down through the centuries, literally. And then, so there's very little reference material on them. And so as a collector, you look for interesting areas to explore. And so I've been specializing in the last few years on kabuki items. I'll show you one.
Well, and here's one that you collected a long time ago, a beautiful Kunisada kabuki.
Yes.
And then one on the right that is an Osaka one. Okay, I have to stop.
It's a recent purchase of a Osaka kind of a playbill. It's a redoing of a kabuki play that people could take home with them. So beautiful color reproduction, a bit worn, it's had a life of 300 years. So it's an interesting, and very few people are interested in these kind of books, except I'm sure that the Kieslak will do an exhibit or something someday.
We will do one. And then another thing that you collected that is often left out are the book wrappers. The book, if you had a little 2-volume book like this one I have at home, you would get a wrapper that went around it when you bought it, and people tended to throw those away. And so this has been, and of course these are so charming and beautiful. You also collected one of the most famous books of popular literature from this period, the Kunisada and Yutei Tanehiko book, The Imitation Murasaki Rustic Genji. And we have the entire set here. And we have also some of the kinds of books that were related, made around the same time, around Genji themes, and here also in the form of erotica. And the collection, yesterday we were talking about the erotica collection, and I counted it up. There are 98 titles in the Tress collection, which makes it a very large collection of erotica. And here we have two of the most exquisite examples. I'm going to keep going, and because I'll give you time at the end to say more things, but we talked about this example yesterday too. This is a really great thing. It's really great that there are some copies, multiple copies of things in the collection. So for example, we have here a couple of books that in two impressions, and we can see that there's difference in terms of the publication, the printing between the two of them, and you can see that there's quite a bit of difference there. I don't know why those blue lines are suddenly appearing, and here's an extraordinary case. And so a student and I spent, this is the great thing about teaching with these books, is you can spend the time looking at these together here, and so we can also look at your books of Mount Fuji by Hokusai that appeared in, there are 4 impressions in the collection. And we'll come back to those maybe. And then the collection of fun books and humorous books. People in the Edo period had a lot of fun, enjoyed thinking about what those demons might be doing at night and about the kinds of people that existed in the world, and made fart jokes just like we do today. And here it all is. In the Meiji period, you collected a lot of things in the Meiji, Taisho, and early Showa periods, including this important book by Kyosai, showing traditional painting and some new studies from life. There are a number of important design books in the Tress collection, including designs for fans and for Howdy jackets. Artists were invited to make different kinds of study pattern books like this, as we can see here, a couple of wonderful examples. And finally, the last pair of books I'm going to show, a couple of more design books that are really extraordinary. I'm just going to close this out by saying some of the things that we're doing with Arthur's collection. We're teaching from it. We're having scholars come. There's a group of Japanese scholars that have gotten a grant to come look at the Tress collection. They've been put on pause right now because of the coronavirus situation. I was also delighted to teach with it last summer and in Rare Book School. And then over the course of this past year, I think I had one of the most enriching and meaningful teaching experiences of my 20-year career so far, having curatorial seminars where students worked with the books directly. We had an exercise called Adopt a Book, where they did research about the individual books. In the fall semester, we had a Google chat with you, Arthur. Here you are on the screen. And the students gave presentations to you about their books. And then they've all been working on or making designs for the cases for exhibitions and comparing the books with your photographs. They also produced this website that I'll invite our viewers to go and look at, where you can see more about this collection. And Arthur, you continue to collect and make photographs. I'm going to close out the formal part by saying thank you to all our friends, and especially to you, Arthur. And then I'm going to turn it back to you, Arthur. I'm just going to keep saying thank you, Arthur, but also to say, do you want to, where do you want me to go back? What do you want to say about it?
We've covered the territory.
Well, maybe we should see if there are any questions.
Yes.
Oh, right. Wonderful presentation. I have loved seeing all of the wonderful treasures of this collection. And we do have several questions coming in through the chat. The first is from Dorothy, who asks, do we know the names of some of the wood carvers who have worked on these materials?
Do you want to start?
Well, Julia, actually, quite often the wood carvers were given credit in the book, right, Julie? Julie knows more about that than I do.
Yes, often the woodblock carver's name will appear in the colophon in the back of the book. And this particularly happens when the carver is a known and appreciated person. As you probably know, this was a collaborative project where the artists would receive a commission, or artists and writers would receive commissions from publishers, and then the publishers would create the book, basically hire the carvers and the printers. In some cases, as in cases with many of the poetry books Arthur collected, the poets themselves would go to the publisher and ask the publisher to create the book, and they would pay to have the book made. But to answer your question succinctly, yes, sometimes we know the names of the carvers, and sometimes we even know the names of the printers.
Hi, I'm Ruth Ellen St. Olge. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just checking. So our next question is from Mr. Tress from Ann Sheriff, and they ask, if in addition to collecting, how do you keep up with the scholarship about Japanese illustrated books, such as Julie Davis's book? Have you continuously studied the history of Japanese printed books since you started collecting?
Oh, it's interesting. When I get a new book, and with Google, I Google its name, and Japanese book studies have kind of exploded all over the world. And someone has done their PhD dissertation on a particular book. And, I'm amazed you can read, or a school of books. So there's huge amount of information out there that didn't exist before. And so it's totally wonderful. As I'm saying, like the kabuki books from Edo or Osaka, there's now a catalog from the British Museum on just kabuki books, or by Andrew Gerstow. And that's kind of my Bible of going back and forth. The same thing happened with the shunga books. Shunga, I think, was not allowed to be sold or exhibited in Japan till the mid 1990s. Then they legalized, which was kind of absurd. So they legalized it, and all this material suddenly came onto the market, as well as many exhibits of shunga with huge, 400-page catalogs going into the history of shunga, why it was made, what the people are saying to each other, the humor, the censorship. So it's just become a wonderful field of a scholarship that's kind of available online. So I find out more and more about the books every day.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question come in that then has generated some further discussion, but I think it would be wonderful if you could speak to this a little bit. We had a question about the markings that were visible on the foredge of some of the materials. Perhaps my pronunciation is probably going to be terrible. Shikoku, and could you please provide some information about those marks and what purpose they serve?
Well, I pulled out this. I have a very small collection, about half a dozen books, because I'm busy all the time. But I pulled out this book because I wanted to show everybody how cool it is in the way in which the covers go together like that, that these are two parts of a single part of this serialized novel. But now that you've asked this question, I can show you exactly what you're talking about. You can just see it here on the edge of the book, right? And so I will, because this is my own copy, and I didn't pay a lot for it. I'll open it up. So Japanese books are constructed like this, where the printing is on the outside of the page, and then the cut edge of the paper is bound in the center. And then along the foredge, as you're calling it, that space that would be down the middle of the block is called the hashira, or the pillar. And what we have here in this hashira is the name of the book, telling us this is part 1, and that this is page 13. So this is also really useful if you think about how it would have been produced, you know, printed, and then all the pages delivered to the shop. They would have to, of course, fold them and then insert them into the book. And so this page, which is sheet 13, would then be, you know, bound into the middle of the block, into the book. And so that's really useful information. Now, the other reason that's really useful is that in this case, we've got the name of the artist and the writer on the exterior of the book. But if we didn't have this exterior of the book, if you go into the interior of the book, there's no title here. Often there is a title here in the beginning of the book or in the table of contents. And imagine we don't have any of this exterior information. We only have this interior information. Well, we can deduce the title of the book now from the hashira, right? So we can look this up if we need to. Sometimes these are abbreviated titles, and so sometimes when we catalog books, we'll put down very carefully where we found the title of the book, whether we found it on the exterior of the book, as in the part 1 of this pair, or whether we found it in the interior. It's not here in the interior, or whether we found it on the hashira, and that's really important in terms of cataloging. So that was fun.
Okay.
So our next question is from Camille, and they'd like to know whether there are similar collectors of Japanese illustrated books based in the United States. So I guess this would be a question for either Julie or Arthur.
You know, I don't know of any offhand. Most of the collectors, and there were a few of us in the 80s, there may be people who are putting together new collections. It seems reasonable, but I'm not. I'm sure there are people, and they've gotten more expensive. Just for instance, with the shunga, after all the museum exhibitions, whatever, the prices of those books went up quite a bit. And they're still a bargain, but they're thousands of dollars now. So, but when I was putting together my collection, it was before the exhibits. And so I was able to get the 96 books, you know, for just a few $100s each.
So I don't know of any, I don't know the answer to this question. It's a good question. A lot of the collectors, as Arthur was saying, have sold their collections or given them away in the recent years. I know collectors in other parts of the world, just don't know so many, especially no one with the passion that I see with Arthur.
Oh.
Oh, great. Thank you. Our next question is from Jim Stokes, who asks, oh dear, Arthur has stepped away.
No, I'm here.
Okay. Who has a question for you, Arthur. He asks, please, what is it about these books that grabbed your attention and sparked the collecting activity?
You know, one, as I said, as a child, I love books. I love making books. And so I've made my own little A-home that you can buy from Amazon. This was published, this is Teapot Opera. And so I use them for inspiration, you know. I mean, any collector, it has a life of its own. It becomes a sort of obsession. I hate that word. But this is a 3-act opera I wrote with a text. And it's a hardcover. You can get them on Amazon fairly inexpensively. It came out around 1985. this was originally published in Japan, and then the Japanese love this series. They're photographs I did on a toy stage, little still lifes. And then I did the sequel for this called Fish Tank Sonata, where I took an aquarium across America and photographed little still life objects. And it's beautifully packed. It sells for about, used for about $6. And then for each one, there's a poem. My little haiku about the illustration. So it was, okay. So it's very interesting. So that's how I justify to my, accountant and the tax people me buying these books. If that answers your question.
Yes, our next question is from Brian Draper, and he was wondering if you could talk a little more about the changes you've seen and experienced in collecting Japanese books over the years.
Okay, well, first of all, and I think Japanese books were very scarce. Even they weren't easy to find. It was mostly Western collections, the original group of books that had been brought over to Europe in the 1890s. And they were just being resold. There were big auctions of those books in the 1920s. And they'd come up, and there were a few dealers, print dealers in London particularly, who loved Japanese books secretly. And so, but there really were only about 10 collectors. Now, I think with the internet and Google Translate, a lot of the material, you can get it from all over the world now. It's sort of come out of the closet, a lot of this material, especially the shanga. And so probably in the last 10 years, I've been able to double or triple the size of my collection. But one has to work at it. You can look at thousands of titles on the internet and only one or two will be interesting. But a big source of books are book fairs. The international antiquarian book fairs, and they have Japanese dealers come from Japan, and usually little, very high prices for some reason, because they're selling perfect editions. But I've been able to find things that kind of squeeze in between, I think. Does that answer the question a little bit?
I think so, yes, I think so.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot more books out there, but probably fewer collectors. Except maybe, if Julie and, is planning some exhibits and publications. But now when there's a museum exhibit, say on the pleasure quarters of Tokyo, they always include lots of books. There's always many books, so it's being integrated into the general history of prints and other parts of Japanese visual culture. Plus, in fact, there are 2 videos on YouTube about Hokusai, where they relate his manga and his books to the current as being the antecedents and current background for the manga revolution. So those younger people who design, those artists adore Japanese books, unfortunately, especially ones with yokai, Japanese ghosts. So if a Japanese book appears on the market and it has one or two goblins, the price will go off the roof. Because it's all these younger collectors who love manga. Okay.
And I think one thing that's been really amazing for me, I've told Arthur this before, is the transformative experience that this is for our students. That, as he was saying, there's a kind of power and resonance in these books, and because this is a study collection, we and because of the way that the Penn Libraries works, we make it possible for students to, hold these books in their hands, and they learn how to handle them. They learn how to understand them. And we have work with our materials library or conservation lab to have a session where we learn how to make books like this, how to produce them and how to bind them. And so I'm really lucky to be in a place where this kind of full experience of the book can be shared with students. And to me, I think what's been really challenging about the shift in my seminar in the middle of the spring semester, we suddenly were no longer able to have our weekly session with the books. I would put the books on the tables, the students would come and just be completely absorbed, and we had to find ways to do this online. And it's been challenging as a result of that, because to me, there's a kind of, it's like close magic, that magicians perform. They do it right in front of you, and they absorb you. And I see the same thing happening with my students. And I can just imagine how if I opened this book right now and showed them with this giant spider here, they would be utterly transfixed. And students of mine who are artists and writers have really had their experience transformed by this. And so I think that's part of what makes this so great. It's something that Arthur's understood for a long time, and I'm really, really grateful that he's sharing it with all of us now.
Okay.
Well, we have reached our end time, but I did want to share a note that Lynn Farrington, who is the Senior Curator of Special Collections, posted at Penn, that is, has posted in the chat. She remarks, Julie has been invaluable to work with in developing our Japanese collections, both prints and books. It has been a great pleasure working with her on this amazing material and seeing it being used in classes and with visiting workshops, exhibitions, and special events. She's been a great spokeswoman for all this material, and thanks to Arthur and all the other collectors who have been inspired by the work. So thank you, both of you, for this wonderful presentation. It's been delightful to learn, and thank you to all of our participants who joined us.